Welcome everybody to the Zoom event organized by San Diego State University's College of Arts and Letters Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies. I'm the director of the center, Professor Ahmet Kuru, Professor of Political Science, and we are honored today to have world-renowned scholar Olivier Roy, who is the author of more than a dozen books and world-renowned scholar on many subjects, including political Islam, analyzing from Europe to Central Asia, from Afghanistan to Turkey. And he recently has a new book on culture and norms, showing the scope and depth of his intellectual contributions. Olivier Roy wrote many books, one of them, The Failure of Political Islam, translated many languages. Another on the nation building in Central Asia, analyzing post-Soviet republics. Then he has a highly cited book titled Global Islam. And then he also wrote about Christianity in France, Turkey's membership to EU process and democratization. And then most recently, he has an edited volume on religion and populism, one of the most important book on the subjects, Hijacking the People. And today we are happy and honored to have him to discuss a very timely topic, religion and populism worldwide. As no need to emphasize that here in America, now this is the hot topic after the elections, but we are looking to have Professor Roy's insights on the global process. After his remarks, I will have some questions. Then the floor will be open to audience. Audience will be able to ask questions by writing in the Q&A. And already I am seeing questions there, and I'm going to read them to Professor Roy. And hopefully we will record and upload the video on YouTube to the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies channel. You can also sign or email newsletter to learn about our activities or check our website, cis.sdsu.edu. So without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Professor Roy for his remarks on religion and populism worldwide. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. I'm very glad to speak in this meeting. So I will start my remarks by saying that usually, traditionally, religion and culture, identity are connected. We have Greek civilization, like the Christian civilization, the Muslim civilizations, where the issue of faith, culture, belonging were connected. What is new now is the disconnect between religion and culture. And this is a consequence of secularization. The secularization movement, which started in the West mainly from the 18th century, led to de-Christianization of the Western culture. We have to put some nuances, of course, to such a statement. In the 19th century, in the 20th century, we could say that the secular culture of the West was a secularized Christian culture. For instance, the conception of the family, of gender, of, I would say, even of sin, adultery, for instance, were similar between the norms of the Christian religion and the norms of the new secular society. But something did happen in the 60s when we saw the emergence of a new, if I can say that, a new culture, the culture of the 60s, which stressed individualism, sexual freedom, and and rejection of the traditional culture as being oppressive, alienating, an anti-Christian feeling, not necessarily an anti-spiritual feeling, but an anti-Christian feeling. So in the 60s in the West, we have a real disconnect between religion and religion, Christianism, and the new dominant culture. The Pope, Paul VI, immediately understood the issue when he published his encyclical Later Humanae Vitae in 1968, condemning the new conception of sexual freedom among the Western society. And he asked the Christians to abstain, to reject this new secular culture. Same thing with John Paul II, same thing with Benedict XVI. Well, they blamed the new Western culture for being not only profane, but pagan, to be against religion. And this phenomena of, I would say, religions blaming the secularizations, blaming, the most of the believers for having abandoned, for letting down the traditional tenets of religion, we find it everywhere. In Islam, in the Muslim world, Salafi started to say that the dominant culture, including in Muslim countries, has ceased, has stopped to be really Muslim, to be Islamic, and that the believers have to regroup, and to try to reorganize their personal life around the true tenets of religion. So the ideas are that the true tenets of religion are opposed to the dominant or increasingly dominant secular culture. So what is the relation with populism, in that? Apparently, there is no relation with populism. We have a separation between an increasing secular culture and in more and more isolated religious faith community, which doesn't feel represented by the dominant secular culture. But something else happened in the same time, something which is embedded, I would say, or represented by the Huntington theory of the clash of civilization. Interestingly enough, Huntington has a totally different vision of religion and culture than the vision I am providing to you now. He, contrary to me, he thinks that he thought that culture, the modern contemporary culture, are secularized religion. So he defined culture as identity. While in the same time, the hardcore believers were defining religion not as an identity, but as faith and norms, religious norms, faith and law. So we have a discrepancy between two visions of religion. Was as an identity, which doesn't suppose that the people really believe. So it just supposes that the people recognize themselves as Christian or as Muslim from a cultural and identity point of view. On the other hand, we have fundamentalist religious communities which try, to separate themselves from this new secular society, and claiming that we should return to the true tenets of religions. Why the reasons why we call them fundamentalists. So, for the populist, religion is not a faith. Religion is not an issue of practices. It's an issue of identity. especially in the West. If we look at the European populists, very few of them are practicing Christians. And I would say most of them are, in fact, pure products of the culture of emancipation, of sexual freedom of the 60s. The paradox, for instance, if you look at Germany, the leader of the AfD party, which is an extremist populist party, reclaiming German identity against migrants, etc. Well, she's homosexual, and she's living with a woman from the Indian subcontinent. She has 2 children without any fathers, etc. So she's absolutely not a representative of the traditional Christian family and way of life. But she claims that we should go back to European Western Christian identity in order to expel migrants, and especially Muslim migrants. In France, same thing. Marine Le Pen, the head of the Rassemblement National, National Rassemblement, is absolutely not a model of a Christian housewife. On the contrary, same thing with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Same thing for Geert Wilders in Holland. And if we look at the USA, we cannot say that Donald Trump is a representative of the traditional Christian family. He is exactly the contrary, if we look at private life, family, sexual life, etc., etc. So the paradox is that the Western populists who want to fight, of course, immigration, Islam, etc., claim to defend a Christian identity, but are not interested at all with Christianity as a religion, as a faith, as a practice, as a system of values and a system of norms. And these tensions are very present. Let's take, the recent elections in the USA. Trump did support the prohibition of abortion, reluctantly, apparently, but his main constituent, the American Protestant evangelicals, put the banning of abortion at the core of their revendication, to defend an American identity. So he gave them what they wanted, the ban of abortion, or at least, to let the states decide about abortion. But in the meantime, 2 or 3 days ago, he said that he will subsidize in vitro fertilization, which is absolutely opposed by the Catholic Church and by any fundamentalist, Christian. So what we see is that the populists are using religious identity as a way to expel, to fight against other cultures, other religions. But they are not putting in place a Christian state or a Christian system of norms and values. The only place in Europe where we had a successful Christian populist movement was Poland. In Poland, the PiS, which is the populist party, is explicitly a Catholic party. It has the support of the Catholic clergy, or at least of the majority of the bishops, and he claimed that he will turn Poland again into a Catholic state and nation. But they lost the elections last year. or 2 years ago, they lost the elections. And if we look at the statistics of religious practices in Poland, we can see that during the 8 years of the power, the government of the peace, the percentage of practicing Christians in Poland decreased from 60% to 30%. And among the youth, it's even under 20%. So the big paradox is that the victory of a Christian populist party has, for consequences, a de-Christianization of the country. And I will stop on that. If we would like to make a comparison with the Middle East, we have the same or almost the same trends in Iran. The consequence of 40 years of an Islamic government and state in Iran is the most secularized society in the Middle East. In Iran now, people just stop to go to mosques. I am not saying that they are becoming atheists. That's another story. Many of them still claim to be Muslims, but they don't practice, or they look for other practices. They go to Sufism, for instance, or they invent themselves some sort of mysticism, spirituality, or they convert to Christianity. So we see that the populists are torn between a dominant reference to Christianity, which is purely identitarian and has nothing to do with practices and faith. But on the other hand, the few of them, the populists, who push for a religious state simply contributes to the secularization of their own society.
Thank you so much for these very insightful remarks. And Professor Roy, let me briefly give the context for the latecomers. People are still coming, and also for the audience. So you referred to Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis. And after 9/11, the war on terror also shaped the paradigm, referring to Islam as a source of Muslims' every actions, especially related to violence. Gilles Kepel and others in the French and other contexts keep referring, and today in Germany and Austria, with some recent terrorist attacks, once again, people are blaming Muslims and their religion for activities. And you may be the most important scholar emphasizing that we have to look at other issues rather than simply focusing on religion, on analyzing complex issues. So I have two follow-up questions. One, you very good explain the case of Europe, even in Poland, with the declining secularism, there is an identitarian dimension of religion and populism. I want to ask, when you compare Europe with America, India, Turkey, and Israel, do you see that Europe is an exception with more secularized society, whereas in Turkey, Israel, India, maybe to some extent America, more religious societies? Can we say that in Europe, yes, religion is more an identity, but in the rest of the world, there is more faith-based, more authentic religious reference? You explain Iran, but is Iran an exception or showing the general trend in the Middle East and elsewhere? I want to start with this question.
Of course, Europe is the most secularized part of the world. That's clear, And it's a long-term trend. It started 2 centuries ago. And so many people, including, of course, Huntington, opposed the secular Europe to the religious rest of the world, including the USA. I will not speak too much about the USA, of course, but just let's look at the statistics. the secularization of the USA is on the way, Slow, it's slow. The majority of the Americans still claim to be believers, to practice religion, etc., etc. But we have a clear erosion, which has accelerated during the last 30 years. For the other part of the world, let's take the Muslim world. What is interesting is that the Salafi, for instance, don't say that the Middle East is culturally Muslim. They don't buy Huntington. On the contrary, they claim that there is a movement of not necessarily secularization, but we can say kafirization, that society is becoming more and more non-religious, heretics, pagans, etc., etc. Of course, we are not obliged to take them at their own words, but the fact that the most, dynamic religious movement, among others, but the most dynamic religious movement in the Middle East is claiming that the Muslim societies are less and less Muslims and are not Islamic. So that's something which is important. And I think that they understand that the same trends are going on. What was seen as a revival of Islam in the, let's say, from the 70s is a complex phenomenon. Because, yes, there was also a religious revival, clearly. But it was also a political movement, a political upheaval. After the 67 defeat against Israel, after, I would say, the crisis of Arab nationalism, there was a claim that secular ideologies do not work, like Arab nationalism, Marxism, and so on, and that we have to go back to the true tenets of Islam, to recreate either Islamic states or at least Islamic movements that could be able to win when where the secular Arab movement lost. But it didn't work. It didn't work. Iran, the story of the Muslim Brothers, etc., shows that Islam as a political ideology simply doesn't work. We can study that also, look at that also in Turkey. What I called Islamism, which means Islam as a political ideology, simply was not able to re-Islamize the civil societies. You can always take the state. You can always impose Sharia, or you can push from more Sharia into the law. But you cannot oblige the people to go to the mosque. And what we see is the paradox of the Islamization from above is that when the state take over the clergy, transform the imams into civil employees, civil state employees, then the people have less and less incitations or to go to mosque, because what they will be delivered is a bureaucratic preach, if I can say that, preach written in a ministry or by an administration of religious affairs, and it's true in Egypt, it's true in Turkey, it's true in Morocco, etc., etc. So the few political successes of the Islamists didn't result in a rise of Islam in the civil societies. That's that. So my point of view is that we have a process of secularization in the Muslim world, but we should not confuse secularization and disbelief. The people might be religious, but they might consider that religion has nothing to do with politics. In a way, for many people, for many believers, real believers, politicization of religion is the death of religion. So we have a trend either to leave religion or to want to isolate religion from politicization. So we have these both trends. And I call these both trends secularization. It's not de-Islamization, it's secularization. So I see the process of secularization. In India, it's different. In India, Modi, the prime minister, is trying to reconstruct Hinduism as the national religion of India. And especially by, excluding Muslims from not the, maybe a formal citizenship, but at least from the true citizenship. For him, Muslims are traitors. They are not really Indians, even if they have the identity card. But in order to do that, Modi has to transform, Hinduism from a civilization into a mere religion. Hinduism is something extraordinary. It's a civilization. It's a world in itself. And you have many, many different trends, many different ways to be a Hindu in India or abroad, India, outside India. In the north of India, in the south, it's not the same kind of Hinduism. But he is trying to reorganize Hinduism, I would say almost, on the model of a Western religion, with a clergy, with a theology, with a dogma, and things like that. And because he cannot accept, he cannot, recognize the caste system as a constitutional system, it's very, very difficult. So he just ignores the caste system. He ignores the sociology of Hinduism. He ignores the anthropology of Hinduism. He ignores Hinduism as a culture. So in this sense, for me, he's deculturalizing Hinduism by constructing Hinduism as just a religion instead of a complex civilization. So my conclusion is that yes, the deculturation of religion and the reconstruction of religion outside, the outside culture and outside politics is a general trend.
Thank you so much. This is very helpful. A follow-up question is that if religion is not at the center, even if we see Putin and Netanyahu, for example, using religious discourses mobilized for their wars or politics, is it all about economy? Because, since the time of Weber and Marx, scholars generally move from one extreme to other, from cultural determinism to economic determinism. What is your position in this? Do you think that we have to explain everything with economy, or at least a socioeconomic trend of modernization, absence or presence of modernization? Are you suggesting a more economy-driven perspective?
No. And I will dare to say on the contrary. No. Okay. First, religions adapt to economics. You can have socialist Christians, capitalist Christians. You have this new theology, the theology of prosperity, which is going along with the Trump way of considering economics, etc., etc. And then you can have people who accept to be poor in order to follow religions. So in this sense, I am not a Marxist. I think we have to take religions seriously and not just to think that religion is always something else. For the best of the worst, religions are religion. And if we look now at the way it works, it's very complex. As Max Weber said, religion can go on with sociological and economic changes. That's clear. Protestantism is good religion for, I would say, middle classes on the way up. It provides you with an ethic, with a vision of the world. And it allows you to think of yourself not just as interested by money, but interested by values, etc., etc. If we look at the Orthodoxy, Christian Orthodoxy, it's clearly, it has always go on with nationalism. The Orthodoxy is seen by Putin as the state religion of Russia. Same thing in Serbia, same thing in Ukraine, by the way. Every time an Orthodox nation rose, or becomes independent, these nations wants to have its own patriarch, its own Orthodox church. It's why there is no universal Christian Orthodoxy. It's always ethnic, always national. And we can see in the Middle East, for instance, the way the local Christian Orthodox churches are not converting. They are centered on themselves. They are always based on some vision of the church as an ethnic or as a community, which is not open to the rest of the world. In Israel, what we have now is the captation of the state by religious radicals. And it's something interesting because it looks like, in a sense, as Pakistan. Both countries were born at the same time, 47, 48. Both countries were created as the country of a religious group. The Jews and the Muslims for Pakistan. At the beginning, both countries were secular. They see to be a Jew or to be a Muslim or something cultural than something religious. But in the course of the time, the fundamentalists, both the Jewish fundamentalists and the Muslim fundamentalists, came with a very coherent approach. They said, if we are a Muslim country, like in Pakistan, we should be an Islamic country. We should have the Sharia as a law of the state. And in Israel now, we have the ultra-Orthodox, we have the fundamentalist Jews coming and saying, if we are a Jewish state, we should have Judaism as a state law. And we should exclude the others, not only because they are not Jewish, but because they are secular. So they're also fighting the secularists, in both their own secularists, if I can say that. So this process of growing an increase of a national fundamentalism, if I can say that, national religious fundamentalism, is not in contradiction with my thesis of the growing secularization. It's, on the contrary, a reaction against this secularization and an endeavor to embed religion into nationalism and to embed the state into religion. It's why I think it will, first, it produces violence, more than violence. So this kind of religious nationalism are more violent than the secular nationalism because they are convinced to go in the right direction towards the final victory of religion in the world, towards apocalypse, the end of the world, the victory of religion. So there are more violence. but they also introduce more and more tensions, which is obvious in Israel. More and more inside tensions. And the secularists are caught between their own fundamentalists and their own secular nationalism, because they are nationalists. Of course, they are nationalists. But we don't see an increase of religious practices. In Russia, it's obvious. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was, for I would say some years, religious revival. Young people came back to churches. They were curious. They wanted to see what it means. And so we had an increase in people becoming priests or monks and so and so. It's finished. It's finished. Once again, in the Russian churches, we had now only old people and especially old women. Among the Jews, the refusal of the Orthodox Jews to accept secular Jews will lead to growing tensions and fragility. Inside Israel, we can see now a growing divorce between the present Israeli state and the American Jews, for instance, who feel they are still supporting Israel, of course, but they feel more and more estranged from the dominant conception of religion in Israel.
Thank you so much. These are very insightful. And I remember when I was walking in Paris last summer, saw the cathedral built by Putin. And then I said, oh, Putin is Christianizing even Paris now. And then you explain so well the connections between the state policy, etc. And in fact, it was my next question about nationalism. So I want to put it in the context of your famous book on the fall of political Islam 30 years ago, published. And then when I look at it, let me ask this way. Your book was saying that Islam as a political project with parties or a political system, it will not be working. And you also said it in your earlier remarks today. But as a fundamentalist cultural traditions, more Sharia-based notions, it will revive. It may be even flourishing. So therefore, when people read your book, they all think that, oh, he's talking about complete decline of Islamization. No, in different forms, it may be flourishing, as it happens in certain countries. Now, I want to ask about nationalism. Nationalism and religion in European context, at least if we take Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities book seriously, emerge in reaction to the Pope, to Latin language, to the divinely ordained monarchies, and saying, no, we have secularism or national churches. We need vernacularization of language, and we need nation states. But today, in most of the cases you discuss, we see nationalism and Islam in the Middle East context, nationalism and Hinduism, nationalism and Jewish tradition seems to be two pillars of populist leaders, even in America. How do you explain, how come nationalists and religious groups solve their conflict? And do you think this inherent conflict between the two may eventually make them break up again in the future?
Yeah, it depends of the local context, of course. The problem is that, let's suppose that a nation state claimed to be a religious state. We had that in different forms, Russia, but also Denmark, Norway, America, and most of the Muslim countries. When the state uses religion, on the long term, he undermines religion, because people are not interested with the state religion or if they identify with a state religion, as in Denmark or Norway or Sweden, they just don't go anymore to the church. For them, to be a nominal member of the national church is just, a part of being a citizen. But it doesn't entail faith. It doesn't entail belief. No. We had the very interesting case of a Danish pastor 10 years ago. We said, I don't believe in God. No, I don't believe in God, but I am still a pastor of the Danish National Church because it has nothing to do with faith. And of course, there was a big uproar and so, but he was allowed by court to stay as a non-believing pastor. That's the paradox. Nationalism contributes to secularize religion and to turn religion into a purely identitarian repertoire. That's the case in Russia. So that's the case in America, etc., etc. We have, yes, this kind of denaturation of religion. As a reaction, and especially in Islam, there are believers, so the Salafi, for instance, who said we should stop to interfere with politics. Because in fact, at the end, it's politics which wins. Now, if we want to be real believers, we should live separated life, not opposing the state, but we should live as a community of the true believers, which is a very Protestant attitude. It's the Salafi, until recently in Egypt, but the Salafi avoided to participate in politics. It's why they were tolerated by the different regimes in the Middle East. But even Salafism is in crisis now. It's in crisis for different reasons. One is Salafism is stressing norms, like Protestant evangelicalism, for instance. So, and people, you might, in your life, you might, at a certain period, you might be fascinated by a normative way of life because you are lost, because you are young and you are looking for guidance. But after, I would say, 10 years of Salafism, many young people are fed up. They want more than that, And they want also to have a social practice. They want to have a good job. They want to marry. They want to have a family, etc., etc. And so they didn't stop to be believers, but they normalize their religious life and they adapt it to a secular society by keeping faith as a private thing. So we have this normalization, I would say, of belief among Muslims, which is for me increasing now. And the crisis of Salafism is well illustrated by what is going on in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is very interesting. Saudi Arabia was built on the alliance between a tribe and a clergy, the Wahhabi clergy. And so the tribe, the South, was in charge of politics, of international relations, of business, etc. And the Wahhabi clergy was in charge of civil society, marriages, divorces, and so on. It worked well until 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, the heir to the MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, in just a stroke of pain, decided to deprive the Wahhabi clergy of its control on the civil society. And he went further. He decided to rebrand the political legitimacy of the Saudi kingdom into a nationalist nation-state brand. Saudi doesn't mean now Wahhabi. Saudi means a nation-state. He's reconstructing Saudi Arabia as a nation-state. And interestingly enough, he bypassed the traditional concept of Jahiliyyah, the idea that before Islam there was nothing or nothing interesting. And suddenly he rehabilitated the past, the pre-Islamic times, through archaeology, for instance. They are launching a huge program of archaeology's excavation, trying to show that there was, a Saudi culture before Islam, which is extraordinary and totally opposed to the Salafi view. It's done through an authoritarian state, of course. Yeah. But what we see clearly now is that nationalism is less and less expressed in religious terms or patriotism. Another example, the Arab Spring in 2011. People went to the streets to say, we are fed up with our leaders, we want more democracy, etc. It's not new. Demonstrations against authoritarian regime have been, in the Middle East for the last 70 years. But it's the first time that there was no reference to Islam during the Arab Spring. In Cairo, in Tunisia, in Syria, nobody was speaking about Islam. They were not against Islam. They were for democracy and freedom of religion. That's a new term which is now rising in the Middle East. Freedom of religion. Look at what's going on in Syria. Jalani has a Salafi and jihadi background. He's obviously a practicing Muslim, and he's not a liberal Muslim, clearly. But he accepts the concept of religious freedom, and that the concept of citizenship as disconnected from religion. He accepts the concept of diversity, ethnic diversity, religious diversity, in the framework of an homogeneous state. He is not a federalist. So he wants a central state, but he accepts diversity, including religious diversity, and not just managing religious minorities. But separating religious affiliation from citizenship. So that's where we are heading now, either from the civil society itself, like in the Arab Spring, or from authoritarian leaders like MBS, or from the new revolutionary people. In fact, they are going in the same direction. Introducing a separation of church and state and accepting some sort of religious diversity.
Thank you so much. Before I get the audience questions, I have a last question for myself, and I'm working on a book project on religion, nationalism, and populism in the US, France, Turkey, Israel, India, and Russia. So my main challenge is to have a prediction about the future and to understand the connection between these cases. So therefore, first of all, do you think they have some connections in each other, discursive, organic, ideological, or it is just the zeitgeist, the spirit of time, that we see them emerging in multiple continents? And second, do you see the fall of populism? Can you write a book on fall of populism? Is it now predictable, or it's too early to talk about the future of this trend? So somehow you are muted, Professor. Yeah, we have to make.
Yeah, this is something common among all this movement, is the reference to religious identity. Clearly. And the will of the state to control religion. Even in China, which is a totally atheistic kind of regime, they cannot accept to let religion outside the realm of the state. They are trying to control religion, clearly. So religious identity is the common point between the different. And your second question, well, I think that populism is very efficient as an oppositional movement. But once you are in charge, what do you do? Yeah. If you try to impose religion, as in Poland, it simply doesn't work. People just leave religion. And it did happen in Iran, it did happen in Poland, it will happen everywhere. So the second point is how can you organize a universal populism? Populism, by definition, is egoistic. It's my country, my people, my village, my town, and so. And it's very difficult to build an international system on populism. And then you have the domestic contradictions in populism. Look at Trump. He has, if I can sum up, he has three constituencies. The nostalgic, the people who say life was better before, and we want to live like in the 50s and 60s, the American dream. These people are maybe religious, but they are not necessarily religious. That's people who just want back to previous, the good old time. Okay. The second people are the evangelicals. And here, it's not just back to the good old time. They want to change the constitution. They want to change the American society. They want to put an end in the separation between church and state, etc. They are revolutionary, in the sense. And so they want to impose religious norms, not to go back to the nice way of living in the. And the last group is the techno-libertarians, Elon Musk. These guys are not interested by the state. They want to destroy the state. But the traditional American conservatives, they want the state. They want a nation state. But Musk is destroying the nation state. So how to manage the three constituents? So I think that the same thing will happen with the populists than happened to the Islamists. The practice of power will destroy the narrative.
Thank you so much. It has been a stimulating conversation. Now I'm asking questions from the audience. Ibrahim El-Marashi, professor of history here in San Marcos, he is asking the following. I remember your 2017 Guardian article, Who Are the New Jihadists? And how you examined the second generation of Muslims in Europe who gravitated to ISIS. How has your argument helped us since then, ISIS making a resurgence, such as New Orleans in this year? I found it valuable for the 2017 Barcelona attacks, as well as the most recent suspects behind the canceled Taylor Swift concert. What do you think about them?
It's interesting to see that since, I would say, 2017, 18, the second generations are no more involved in terrorist actions in France. Clearly, what we have now in all the attacks with knives and so are refugees, people who were excluded from asylum, recent migrants. In Germany, in France, it's now the same profile that we have. So the terrorist actions are no more the expression now of a disenfranchised second generation. First, the second generation is now almost finished. They are grown-up people. We have now a third generation which is not interested in terrorist action. So we have a real shift.
Thank you. And Cheryl O'Brien, professor of political science here at San Diego State, is asking whether religious far right or non-religious populists, they both seem to have a threat of controlling women's rights for the religious or state-centric purposes. In your research, what did you find about the relations between populism and feminism? Is there anti-feminist discourse in both religious and populist trends that help mobilize voters in that direction? Thank you.
That's something very interesting. It's a very interesting question. We have two trends among the populists about concerning feminism. One is the backlash of masculinism. That's clear. Anders Breivik, most of the guys who launch terrorist attack from the extreme right, against Muslims or other targets, they are masculinists. And we see Elon Musk, who is an explicit masculinist. It's funny to see Mark Zuckerberg of Amazon, who was almost woke 20 years ago and now turned into a new masculinist. Okay. So clearly, the alienated males who resented, the rise of women, they are more prone to join feminism, to join populism, clearly. But we have another trend. Look in Europe, many leaders are women. Marine Le Pen, Marion Maréchal, Giorgia Meloni, Weidel, etc., etc. That's interesting. And if you look also at Geert Wilders, the populist of Holland, what do they say? They say Islam is not compatible with the West because Islam is against women. No. So what do? They turn feminism into an identity marker of the West. It doesn't mean that they have a feminist policy. They don't have a feminist policy, of course. But they claim that protecting women and defending the women is a marker of Western civilization against, Muslims. So there is an interesting ambivalence here.
Thank you. Ferit Abdulnoor, also political science professor here at San Diego State. Your talk is a reminder that secularization and bigotry can go together. Since the religious clothing of movements of bigotry against immigrants and outsiders is superficial, why do they drape themselves in the robes of religion? Why they need religion in Europe, for example?
They need religion as an identity marker because they do not have any other identity markers. Now, as populists, they cannot identify with the vision. The problem of Europe. Yeah. Europe claimed to be the best example of a state of rights, human rights, of universal values. But if you pretend to stick to universal values, you cannot exclude migrants. No, you have to say migrants are people, they can be citizens, etc. So if you oppose migrants, you have to find another basis of legitimation, of legitimacy, something else than human rights and the tradition of Europe, freedom, democracy, etc. So they find it in religion as an identity marker.
Thank you. Mücahit Bilici, who is a professor of New York CUNY, he asked, how do you see the relationship between neoconservatism and contemporary populism? Any connection between these two unreligious movements of identitarianism exist now?
I think that present populism is a break with neoconservatism. Neoconservatism was universalist. When people like Wolfowitz and so claim that they will reshape the Middle East by installing democracy in Iraq, etc., they were sincere. I know that what I'm saying is not accepted by many people, but they were sincere. They really thought that democracy is universal. They were like Fukuyama. The idea that after the fall of Soviet Union, Western values of democracy, freedom, etc., should be extended to the whole world. They were anti-Huntington. They didn't buy Huntington. If they would have bought Huntington, they would not have invaded Iraq, which is probably the biggest stupid thing, made during the last 20 years in the world. So it's why they had they turn, imperialism into a defense of democratization, which is absolutely not the point of view of the populists. The populists do not care about democracy, and they don't want to intervene outside. Not because they respect the other culture and so on, just because they think it's too expensive to go for war outside. That's all.
Thank you. So Darius Sharif, a grad student here at San Diego State, asking, with leaders of religious populist movements in several countries are not very religious personally, as we see in the example of Trump. So does that remind us Marx's claim that religion is the opiate of the people? How do you answer a question like that?
If it were the opium of the people, they would at least have tried to look like Christians. But they didn't even try to look like Christians. On the contrary, they show that you have a better life if you are not a Christian. You make more money, you have more wives, more sex, more, so you can do what you want, etc., etc. So they have a Nietzschean view of, from Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, a Nietzschean view of life, absolutely not a Christian view of life. And I suspect that they have a certain contempt for true Christian. It's obvious, for instance, that they have contempt for the Pope. Not only they hate him, but they despise him. So what is interesting is why do some real believers vote for this kind of people? How is it that the true Christians don't find Christian leaders? That's, for me, that's a big question. From Argentina to Italy, France, Germany, USA. How is it that we do not have one real Christian populist leader?
Thank you. Saad Khan is a professor in Pakistan, and he is asking a question about Pakistan and about the Imran Khan. So did you have a chance to analyze former Prime Minister Imran Khan, whether he can be categorized as a populist? If so, how come he's in jail now? Whether in the future he will have more populist support? So the question about Pakistan populism and Imran Khan.
He's clearly a populist. And even if he was himself part of the establishment, he's fighting the establishment. The establishment is this alliance between the army and some sort of a big high bourgeoisie. And this alliance is obvious, with the prime minister and the army. They are working together for years and for years. So in this sense, yes, he's a populist. He's playing on something which might, unite a very diverse country, Islam. So in this sense, he uses the same arguments that Maududi and that General Ziaul Haq. The problem, as always, is kind of populism, is what do you do when you are in charge? He has been in charge. He has been unable to get rid of the army. And I think it's quite a challenge in Pakistan to impose your views on the army. So he's a perpetual opponent. And he will remain a perpetual opponent.
Thank you. So another question by Diliana Minsheva. Does secularization necessarily lead to privatization of religion, especially in the case of Islam? Can it open new forms of public religious engagement? Do you see deculturalization of Islam as a possibility of the rise of individualism. So what do you think about that?
It has been the case. It has been the case because, you know, when you withdraw from politics, withdraw from utopias, you tend to go back to a private sphere. But there is another way. It's to work at the level of the civil society, to create religious networks, religious communities, which are embedded into the civil society. And we have many, many cases like that. In Italy, for instance, the Catholic communities like Comunione Liberazione, Sant'Egidio, they are very active inside the civil society. And in Indonesia also, we have the strong religious Muslim communities who are involved in charity, in teaching, in cultural activities at the level of the civil society. And if it's more difficult in many Middle Eastern countries, it's because of authoritarianism. It's because of the states who are not happy to see any kind of autonomy, including religious autonomy, in the civil society.
Thank you. And an audience from Turkey, Mehmet Yıldız, asking about Turkey. How do we define the role of religion? And the concept of religious can be defined in different ways, and basically asking how Turkey now has a more Islamist populist regime, but as you see, there is secularization. Is it still fair to give some role to Islam in the populist regime now in Turkey?
I think that there is a growing discrepancy in Turkey between official Islam and the religious practices of the people. The people might consider themselves as Muslims, but they are looking for something else. And so we had a revival of the Tariqat, Naqshbandi, etc., etc. The problem is the complex relationship of this tariqat with politics and with the state. Because for the state, especially for the religious state, religious government, it's difficult to accept the idea of the autonomy of religious Muslim communities. So I think the trend among the civil society is to have an autonomy of Muslim communities. But there is a tension with the state, who is trying either to ban or to enlist these religious communities.
Thank you. And a question from France, Dr. Cédric Bayloc, an expert on Islam politics relations, asking, in your thoughtful book 2008, La Saine Ignorance, le temps de la religion sans la culture. So he quote you, chaque fois que l'on a voulu penser les relations entre religion et culture, on s'est mis à tourner autour du mot culture en jouant sur des préfixes déculturés, acculturés, inculturés, exculturés. La religion des cultures, quand elle veut éradiquer le paganisme. So to translate, basically, every time when we refer to religion and culture, we use prefix. The increasing culture, deculturalization, former or subculturalization. So he said, but at the beginning of this talk, you emphasize that there's a separation of culture and religion in certain contexts, especially secularization may bring it. Isn't there an internal pattern of religions or religious fundamentals ideology, which is anti-culture, which reject any form of cultural element of religious practice and thought? So what do you think of this relationship?
So I stressed deculturation of religion, the fact that there is a growing separation between religion and culture. But it's a new phenomenon. And it's very difficult to experience religion without culture. And maybe culture without religion. So we have two different poles, religion and culture, which are in fact which cannot think without the other. Human beings need culture. So even if you are a monk in an isolated monastery, you still have a culture. You still speak a language. You still have kind of relations with the others. You read books, etc., etc. You cannot ignore culture. Religion cannot ignore culture. And culture tries to ignore religion more and more, or culture tries to transform religion into culture. So I think that this tension between religion and culture is part of human life and human destiny. We cannot solve it. There will always be a tension.
Thank you. A question from Algeria, Noha Khalfa, a grad student, asking, what do you think about the future of United States following Orban's example in Hungary? Do you think American democratic institutions will be more resilient or not in the future? What is your prediction about the future of American democracy?
I think America could be more resilient because democracy is more institutionalized. We have first federalism. The states have a lot of power. We have the judicial system, which claims to be independent. So, and then we have people who vote. No? So I think that if Trump is unable to deliver the goods, especially on economy, there will be a reaction sooner or later, in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. Okay. But in the meantime, the American nation would have been largely undermined, and especially the state apparatus.
Thank you. And last question I want to ask about the alternative we may have, those who defend liberal democracy. So even Francis Fukuyama and others accept that liberalism now is perceived either as a right-wing neoliberal capitalistic form which creates inequality without even thinking how to solve this inequality, or the left-wing liberalism turn into identity politics of sex, gender, and other identity issues. So how can we find a solution as an alternative to right-wing populism? What do you think about this? Can liberalism respond to this challenge?
If we try to make things more simple, let's speak of the liberals and of the progressives, who have both an interest into fighting this kind of authoritarian populism. The big mistake they did, both of them, was to ignore the society and to construct abstract systems between themselves. The liberals used to speak about institutions, about the rule of law, about abstract concepts, but they didn't care really about the real life of the people. And the progressists and the so-called wokist people, they made a revolution inside a bubble, the campus of the university. Or even if we look at the Arab Spring places, Tahrir Place, and so. The revolution was done between people who look like each other, who are from the same social milieu, and who try to create a safe space, debating about gender, about democracy, but once again, not going outside. It's typical, the support for the Palestinians in the West is typical. So the students, they gather inside their universities, and they say, we are suffering for Gaza. But that's all, they didn't try to convince the other people, they didn't try to wage political actions, and so on and so. So the liberals and the left were obsessed by norms, gender, rules, and what you want, by norms. So they had a normative approach and not an empathic approach to a society. And they used to live and to speak and to debate inside bubbles on the campuses. So the answer is, let's go to the society. Let's meet the people.
Thanks so much, Professor Roy. It has been a wonderful conversation, and we are also going to put on YouTube that more people will watch. And we are very happy to have you at SDSU. We look forward to have you in person in our campus. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.